they put a new plan together that puts all of Nigeria and our economy in proper perspective.
In other words, may I cut in very quickly, respectfully?
Yes.
That means that if you're coming in 2016, for example,
yes,
that means you will have to take on what the previous administration did.
Exactly.
Put it in the same box.
That's right.
And add what you're doing.
That's right.
And move it forward. In other words, you're not bringing in the caterpillar.
Exactly.
Or moving equipment
everything.
to uproot everything.
Yes.
I said, I don't think I like that.
That's
and I don't
right.
like those who did it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to set up my own. Do you think that is a major problem we've had as a nation from an economic point of view?
That is what has happened to Nigeria. All this why. And in sequence of those particular policies you mentioned, if you look back at SAP, in fact, SAP was even so dramatic because it was the same government that introduced it that reversed it. And I'll give you a quick illustration.
Yes.
Okay. Now, within the context of SAP then, because Nigeria was desperate to encourage foreign investment.
Inflow, yes.
And so we said, look.
Just where we are now.
Exactly. We are putting a ban on the export of certain agricultural produce. And then we add value to them here before we export. Cocoa, I will mention as an example. We said raw cocoa will not be exported again from Nigeria by government policy. And so if you want to export anything relating to cocoa, you have to process it here, either into cocoa butter or cake or whatever. So companies, investors, put money in there, set up factories. 2 years after, 1988, the same government, the same administration reversed that policy. And it became more interesting for farmers to sell their cocoa to the exporter, who will not add any value. Just take the cocoa from the farm gate, take it to the port, have it weighed, and export it.
The export board.
And so the producers, exactly. The manufacturers here, therefore, had no access to that raw material.
The Luigi Poco product,
exactly.
for example.
That was states. What killed that sector. And of course, from then, investors began to think about policy reversal. It's a major issue in Nigeria. Then 1989, we now said, look, obviously, SAP is causing problems. And we needed to introduce what was called then SAP palliatives. Incidentally, I was then a staff of the World Bank. And in fact, that particular bit was my mandate then as a research economist to do a study on what was going on in Nigeria. And we came up with a report, Inflation in Nigeria, that was the title, where it was correctly predicted that if there was no intervention the way we were implementing SAP, there was going to be social chaos.
How come time moves very, very fast? Let's move on very quickly. We need to talk about Vision 2010. That was one massive, great idea.
Yes.
As a young journalist, I had opportunities of being going around the country with some of those who were involved back then with the Vision 2010.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting time how Vision 2010, reading it all over again from the shelf, looks like a document and something that was made out of this world.
That's right.
So what happened?
It was a very good document, well put together. Many Nigerians who had, let me put it, a heart for Nigeria were involved in that process. Came up with a good document, which would have been our roadmap. But we labeled it by the person who was in government then. And so when it was no longer there, we simply dumped Vision 2010. And that's the problem I see with Nigeria. So we now find that we come up with policies that don't last beyond the originator, or let me call it the visioner. So the thinking was that Vision 2010 was an Abacha project. And so Abacha now was out of government, so let's dump that and do something else. That was what led us now into thinking about needs.
Yes, which was the President Olusegun Obasanjo's a pet project. This was to be a 4-year program.
That's right.
And this was a very brief forward that President, the then head of President of the Federal Olusegun Obasanjo says, and he says that over the next 2 years, this is in summary, part of that, what he says, over the next a few years, needs will consolidate the achievements of the previous 4 years, that's of his own administration, because he was in 1999, and lay a solid foundation for sustainable poverty reduction, employment generation, wealth creation, and value orientation. He went on to say that everybody will have to be complemented. This is like a very good one. And some state governments actually move ahead to set up their own seeds, which is SEEDS, at the state levels. So what happens again? This also went into the dustbin.
Now, we must remind ourselves here that NEEDS was a medium-term plan. It won't pass as a national development plan. It was a 4-year plan. And if you look also, and I'm sure you have done this already, at the content, clearly it is part of what I call the Washington Consensus. That's the word for it. Now, on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, it was a medium-term plan. A country doesn't sit on a medium-term plan. You don't plan for a country over a 4-year period. Now, why this was good to transit from a first term that had a pamphlet of a few pages that was labeled Economic Agenda 1999 to 2003. That was all he had for the first term of President Obasanjo. I happen to be one of those that criticized that as not an agenda for Nigeria, that we needed something deeper than that. Of course, NEEDS was a response to that, okay? But NEEDS itself was a medium-term plan, not long-term. Now, any country that is not planning long-term to grow its economy and develop it, we won't get anywhere.
So wasn't Vision 2020 then a long-term plan?
13 years.
Was that long enough under your definition?
In my definition, it wasn't long enough. I expect that if we are doing a development plan for Nigeria, it should be in the range of 25 years. They will now have 5-year components or intervals.
Milestones. Yes.
Within the 25-year plan. Now, it will be rare to have one person remain in charge of the government for 25 years. And that is the relevance of that. If you have that in place, it then means if you are to take over after me, I hand it over to you. Then look at how far I've gone. And that is what we see in most of the countries that rank so highly when you talk about competitiveness in the world today.
But aren't we back to medium-term policy framework now called MTEF?
Now, the idea of MTEF is a 3-year rolling plan.
Yes.
And the way it works simply is that you look at what you intend to spend over the next 3 years, you do your projection of how much revenue you generate over the next 3 years, then you put them together. Now, 2016 ends. You look at the reality of 2016. You factor that into what you projected, and based on that, you now project for 2019. So that becomes your MTEF for 2017 to 2019. It's a 3-year rolling plan. It is actually simply an expenditure plan.
Not a national development plan.
Not a national development plan. I mustn't make that mistake.
Okay. That's really very thought-provoking. Okay, let's take a break. When we come back, I think we've done a bit of looking backwards. I think we now need to look forward, and we'll talk about that for just about a few minutes after the break. Stick around. Dr. Bedu Adedikwe, economist and partner at B. Adedikwe and Associates on this very important discussion. Stick around. We'll be back in 2.